They rode under a name that turned spines cold, the Black Vulture Gang. Wherever they passed, fear arrived first. They didn't steal because they had to. They stole to prove they could. Their cruelty became their signature, their arrogance their armor. No ranch, no family, no town had yet stood against them and survived intact. Their power wasn't just in guns or numbers. Their power lived in reputation, whispered from one mouth to another until men surrendered even before the first shot was fired. The vultures thrived on that fear. Men called them unstoppable. Women prayed to never see them. Children learned their name as if it were a curse. But like all predators, they carried a weakness they could not see: arrogance. They believed no one could stand against them. No one would dare. No one could plan what they did not anticipate. And in the shadows of that arrogance lived Clara Carter, a woman they thought was helpless, a woman they would mistake for prey, a woman whose mind would turn their terror into dust and their legend into ash. And here begins their fall. And before we ride into her legend, I want you to join this campfire circle. Drop a note in the comments and tell me where you're listening from. Doesn't matter if it's a big old city or a small town, you're part of this trail tonight. So, saddle in, folks. The story of dust and gunpowder begins now. There was once a woman whose name carried little weight at first. She did not belong to wealthy families. She did not command a large workforce. She did not grow up surrounded by protection. Her worth was not spoken of loudly in the rooms of men who liked to boast, yet her worth would be written upon the land itself through the quality of her endurance. That woman was Clara Carter. Her life was a set of burdens taken on one after another, each heavier than most shoulders could carry, yet carried all the same. She had known the loss of companionship early. She had known the long grind of work without relief. She had learned not only how to perform the daily toil demanded of survival, but also how to remember it in her bones. For years, survival drew strength out of her and replaced it with steel. Steel of resolve, steel of patience, steel of wisdom earned painfully across time. Others judged from a distance. They saw a woman quiet in demeanor and thought that must mean she was easy to challenge. They mistook her silence for weakness. They measured her against another standard and decided she must be fragile because she did not boast, because she did not argue, because she did not demand her virtues be recognized. But the truth of Clara Carter's strength was not in words. It was written in her persistence. It was proven by her refusal to walk away from the things she had to protect. It existed with no need for announcement. And here lies the difference between those who merely live and those who endure. Endurance becomes the monument of those overlooked. Clara's strength existed outside of approval, and in this way she became a figure prepared for any calamity that might rise against her. Yet calamity, by its nature, comes whether one desires it or not. It comes when quiet living convinces many that they are safe. It comes when people believe tomorrow will simply repeat today. The worst trials arrive not out of fairness, but out of cruelty. And so, while Clara's days had been carved by toil, there came a challenge unlike any she had yet faced. It did not resemble storms of weather. It did not resemble drought or poor fortunes of nature. It came carried upon the actions of men, men unburdened by conscience. Men who thrived on the taking of security from others. Those men were known across wild country as the Black Vulture Gang. Their name was spoken with an edge of dread, for it carried with it a string of warnings. They were not simple thieves. They were not men pushed into crime by need. They were predators of arrogance. They took with force because they could. They relished in humiliation that followed. Their arrival at any ranch, any herd, any camp was not for filling bellies but for asserting power. Fear was their true profit, and they had grown rich on fear. For fear travels ahead of such men. It softens resistance before they arrive. Fear teaches good people to accept the unacceptable. It teaches them to imagine that resistance is pointless. Many would rather yield half of what they owned than face the destruction that these men brought at full measure. This was how the black vultures gained dominion. Not through endless battles, but through the absence of battles, for no one dared to risk one. But Clara Carter was not one to yield or bend. She heard all the same whispers her neighbors heard. She listened to the muttered warnings, the instructions to lower her head, the claims that surrender was the safer path. But where others cowered, Clara practiced thought. She examined the truth inside fear. Fear, she realized, is nothing but a shadow. Real enough to chill one's courage, but empty when struck by light. And men like the vultures depended entirely on those shadows. They fed themselves by convincing others to see them larger than they were. It was in Clara's nature to act differently. She had spent her years solving problems others could not see. She had learned across hardship that where others stopped, she must continue. And now, faced with the gathering storm of the black-winged gang, Clara Carter did what no one expected. She steadied herself, not with weapons, not with rage, not even with allies, but with her own unwavering calculation. What was the measure of men such as these? They were arrogant. They believed themselves invincible. They dressed their reputation in cruelty and sharpened it with laughter at pain. Yet arrogance carries a weakness. It blinds men to their vulnerabilities. It teaches them to repeat mistakes loudly, as though no hand could reach against them. And Clara Carter, with her steady eyes and sharp thoughts, could see those weaknesses forming. Her neighbors mistook her patience for defeat. They assumed her silence meant surrender. They did not recognize the work her mind was performing each hour, measuring, timing, preparing. For Clara knew that every force that prides itself on invincibility leaves a door open. And when that door is discovered, one need not even meet them in equal numbers or strength. Intelligence becomes the stronger weapon. Thus began the legend, not of a duel, not of a shootout, not of some rash display of rage, but of a woman who treated criminals as a puzzle rather than as monsters. Hers was the preparation that dignity builds. For Clara Carter understood deeply, when cunning meets arrogance, cunning will win. And so, while the prairie still whispered gently of peace, preparations began for a different chapter of her life. The rustlers would soon ride, expecting submission, expecting yielded cattle, expecting another frightened household. But they were riding not into helplessness. They were riding into calculation, into resilience, into the moment where all their pride would falter. Because Clara Carter was not a figure of fear, she was a figure of defying fear, and her strength would soon turn the very arrogance of her enemies into their downfall. There is always calm before the storm, always a stretch of quiet where people believe danger will pass them by. But soon that calm ends, and when it ended for Clara, she transformed from a figure of endurance into a figure of legend. The black vultures did not know it yet, but fate had already set their downfall in motion the moment they chose Clara Carter as a target. And so begins the tale told long after, in words carried around firesides, passed through generations of herders and wanderers. They told it with admiration. They told it with respect. They told it as proof that intelligence, patience, and courage can carve victory even against those who believe themselves untouchable. This is not merely a story of outlaws. It is not merely the story of a woman holding fast when others failed. It is the story of dust and gunpowder. Clara Carter had lived through enough loss to understand that a person's measure is never shown in their comfort. The world does not respect ease. It reveals the quality of its people through their endurance in suffering. And Clara Carter had endured. It was not simply that she continued her work without complaint. It was how she shaped her very being out of necessity. Life had stripped much away. It had left her without a partner. It had left her without a family to steady her. It had left her with responsibilities heavier than one pair of arms was meant to carry. Yet she carried them anyway. Each year had carved itself into her, and with every carved year Clara grew harder, steadier, more resolved. She became the human equivalent of iron, hammered again and again in fire, cooled and hardened with every strike. She became dust too, the dust that settles everywhere out in the expanse, inescapable, unyielding, constant. And when neighbors and strangers alike looked at her without understanding, they saw only a woman alone. They saw only quietness. They didn't see the years behind her silence. They didn't see the fires she had passed through. They didn't see that every day of her life had been a test, and she had passed it. That is why, when others murmured her name with pity, the truth was quite the opposite. Clara Carter was not to be pitied. Clara Carter was to be respected. Yet respect does not always rise quickly. Respect must often wait to be proven in spectacle. At that point, the spectacle had not yet come. While others judged with misled eyes, they whispered tales of the black vultures. Men said the gang had grown too powerful, that no single household could resist. That resistance itself only drew greater punishment, and with each whisper came resignation. Neighbors surrendered cattle before they were even demanded. Merchants bent prices, knowing the fear of destruction. The gang's most effective weapon was not their pistols, it was the legend that followed their name. This is important to understand because Clara did not shrink at names. She had already faced loss far greater than men with guns. She had faced emptiness, and she had survived it. When one has endured grief, certain kinds of threats lose their sting. And though Clara listened with care, she did not let fear set its claws in her mind. Her silence gave watchers the impression that she felt the same dread as them, but inside her thinking, something else brewed. Clara Carter possessed a mind sharpened by survival. She had never had the luxury of waste. Every step of her life was built carefully, thoughtfully, with nothing left unused. That same principle guided her when stories of the outlaws grew heavier in the air. Where others felt helpless, Clara began turning over the problem like a stone in her hand, feeling every edge, every curve, every angle. She did so quietly, steadily, patiently. She asked herself not, how dangerous are they, but what makes them believe they cannot be stopped. The difference may seem small, but it was everything. For arrogance is the hidden doorway inside every ruthless man. Strength can overwhelm, guns can kill. But pride blinds. Pride convinces men that repetition is victory. Pride convinces them they need not watch closely. Pride convinces them that their fearsome reputation means their victory is guaranteed each time they ride. Clara Carter understood this deeply, because she had studied people. She had studied neighbors who gave up too easily. She had studied merchants who overcharged when they thought no scrutiny was upon them. She had studied and survived grief itself, which teaches most people to collapse under weight. Clara did not collapse. She watched, and then she planned. This is the iron inside her. This is the dust that lingered, blowing into every corner of her thoughts. Her strength was not just endurance, but the kind of endurance. She endured patiently. She endured with sharp eyes. She endured quietly while others assumed she was standing still. She endured in the way of great predators that only strike when the prey steps blind into their grasp. And now, the great predators known as the black vultures were about to mistake her composure for surrender. They had seen it 100 times in others. They had no reason to assume otherwise, and this assumption would undo them. But Clara Carter still bore responsibilities. This battle was not heroic daydreaming. It was survival, and not just her own. Her herd mattered. Each life of her herd represented years of labor and investment. It represented security not in the moment, but into the uncertain years ahead. Losing them meant collapse, and collapse meant her work, her sacrifices, her independence, all dissolved. So she did what she had always done. She faced reality clear-eyed. She measured what stood before her. She knew that a test of physical strength alone would not favor her. She had only herself. She could not engage them as a unit. She could not rush them as others might. Instead, she would lean on the very thing that had carried her across all storms, her intelligence and her resolve. Clara Carter would not rise against the outlaws through rashness. She would rise by seeing what they could not see, by predicting what they assumed too secure, by designing the moment where their arrogance met the edges of her cunning and shattered. Neighbors could not imagine such thinking. Neighbors saw danger and shrunk away. They were not carved as Clara had been carved. They had not lived her pain. They had not borne her burdens. They could not recognize the kind of quiet strategy being shaped in her mind, because her silence to them looked exactly like theirs. Only hers was a silence of patience. Theirs was silence of fear. This difference would soon be revealed in the starkest way possible. When the black vultures rode to take what they believed was securely theirs, they would not find a rancher, broken, resigned, waiting for mercy. They would find themselves seen, measured, and trapped inside a plan already prepared. This is why Clara Carter would later be remembered not just as someone strong, but as someone crafted, a woman forged of iron and dust. Iron because she did not bend, dust because she lingered everywhere, seeping into cracks, reaching places unnoticed, constant and unavoidable. The black vultures could break fences, they could break men, they could break communities. But what they could not break was a woman who had lived her whole life in the slow fire of quiet hardship, a woman who no longer felt the terror that gripped others, a woman who understood that the most dangerous enemy is the enemy who believes themselves invincible. And so Clara Carter prepared. In her stillness, she already knew that soon she would take the storm meant to destroy her, and she would turn it back upon those who had brought it. Their mistake was already made the moment they set their eyes upon her, because they had chosen someone who no longer carried fear in her mouth, in her heart, or in her mind. That was their undoing, and her victory had already begun. Every legend is tested at the moment of its first blow. Nothing reveals character more sharply than the first loss. For Clara Carter, that test came when the Black Vulture Gang laid their mark upon her. And that moment, though it stripped something from her, did not defeat her. It hardened the edges of her will. The outlaws approached her life as if she were another easy mark. For years they had grown bold, confident, satisfied. Their pattern never changed. They would ride into one's livelihood, seize what they wanted, and ride away laughing. That was their rhythm, simple, brutish, almost thoughtless. Their danger was not in their intelligence, but in their reputation. Others had already convinced themselves to fear them, so they rarely faced real resistance. The first strike they made against Clara was not their grandest effort. Such men do not always crush on their first sweep. Instead, they prefer to tease control, removing just enough to announce their presence, enough to spread fear in advance, to weaken resolve before the final blow. This was the pattern many had seen before. It worked because most people believed there was no answer. Most resisted in loud words, but gave way in quiet actions. After a theft, they yielded even more quickly the second time, knowing it could only grow worse. The black vultures thought this same method would cow Clara. They thought she would fold as others had done. But when the first theft was discovered, Clara Carter did not bend in submission. Her cattle were missing, yes. Evidence of their raid marked the night behind them. By all appearances, they had chosen her, and surely that should have been cause for despair. Yet in that moment, Clara felt something different than despair. She did not cower, she felt clarity, because what that theft revealed to her was not her weakness. It revealed their weakness. She began to see them truly, not as phantoms carried by rumor, not as unstoppable shadows. She saw them as men who followed a pattern, men who had succumbed to arrogance, men who believed themselves clever when in truth they were predictable. What is the first principle of breaking arrogance? It is this: arrogance always underestimates the watchful, and Clara Carter was nothing if not watchful. Every step of her life had taught her to observe. Every task she had undertaken had trained her to notice what others ignored. The raid, far from destroying her, simply offered her something invaluable: knowledge. She read that strike with the careful eye she had learned across years of surviving alone. Each detail mattered. Every choice they had made revealed more of their nature. The way they had taken some cattle but not all, the way they had arrived with casual motions, the way they had left with confidence rather than speed. These things mattered because they told her everything she needed to know about how they would act again. Others, had they been in her place, might have collapsed into fear. They might have stared at the gap left behind, counted only what was lost, and surrendered the rest of their days to hopelessness. Clara did not permit her mind to turn in that direction. To her, losing something was not the end. Losing something was merely information. Loss became material, which she could shape and rebuild as part of her strategy. This is where Clara's mind began to separate her from everyone else. Instead of focusing on grief, she focused on pattern. Instead of mourning what was stolen, she examined what was revealed. Every strike by an enemy is not merely harm, it is a piece of intelligence. And intelligence, used correctly, can outweigh strength many times over. She realized in that moment that the black vultures operated under the same assumption over and over again, that fear would prevent their victims from seeing clearly. If she refused to give herself to fear, then she could see them clearer than they saw themselves, and by that clear sight she could prepare. But beyond her calculation, something deeper took root: resolve. For men such as the black vultures preyed on communities by insisting no single person could stand against them, by teaching the lie that their dominance was universal. Someone must break that chain, or all would continue to bow. Clara Carter did not decide this out of vanity. She did not imagine herself a warrior out of grand fantasy. She chose because there was nothing else to choose. Her survival depended on it. Her independence demanded it. And so the role fell squarely upon her own shoulders, and she accepted it with the same endurance she had accepted every other burden of her hard life. The first strike, then, did not mark the weakening of Clara Carter. It marked the strengthening. It became her point of fire, refining her determination like metal purified through heat. Where others said the black vultures could not be stopped, she began to whisper within her very blood that of course they could. For what arrogant men detest most is not force, it is clarity. Clara Carter would meet arrogance with clarity. She would meet shadow with endurance. She would meet cruelty with calculated defiance. And her preparation, born from the moment of loss, would become their undoing. Fear is the most recognized enemy, and yet it is the most misunderstood. Those who surrender to it believe fear is a wall they cannot climb. They believe fear is a weight that cannot be lifted. But Clara Carter understood something more profound. Fear is only a shadow, and a shadow, no matter how large, has no substance of its own. When the first theft was discovered, neighbors spoke quickly of doom. Their whispers echoed through one another, feeding the sense of inevitability. They looked not at the men themselves, but at the stories hanging off the men's names. They repeated those stories until they grew even taller than before. They turned men into monsters in their minds, and they let those monsters live inside them as guests. Clara refused such hospitality. She did not invite shadows into her household. She did not feed them with her breath. She watched her neighbors succumb and realized why the black vultures had remained powerful for so long. Their power was allowed. Their cruelty was multiplied by fear more than by action, and those who trembled gave them victory long before the first chase. She did not despise her neighbors for this. To fear is human. To tremble when reputation is shouted down upon you is natural. But Clara Carter had moved through grief. She had stared at the greatest loss a person can know: the loss of love, the loss of partnership, the loss of a life once whole, and from that pit she had stood again. Fear had already tested her, years before the black vultures came, and she had found herself still standing when the test was over. This, she believed, gave her something the outlaws could never quite erase: perspective. What was a gang of arrogant thieves compared to the silence of widowhood? What was the threat of losing her herd compared to the burden of carrying everything alone for years already? Yes, the danger was real. Yes, their guns and cruelty carried weight in the world, but the greatest weapon they carried was the belief that they were untouchable. Clara measured their mythology and found it wanting. She began to count their patterns the way others count livestock. She weighed their methods. She considered how often arrogance leads to repetition. For when men believe themselves invincible, they do not innovate. They do not hide their footprints. They repeat themselves again and again because habit feels like dominance. She also considered the timing, how they preferred to strike first lightly, how they liked to torment rather than devour at once. She realized they had chosen the wrong woman for that game. By leaving her enough to prepare, they had ceded their own defeat. In thinking they had control of her spirit, they had only given her time. And in time, Clara Carter became unstoppable. Fear grew among the homesteads, but Clara treated it as a mathematician treats numbers. She counted where fear started. She counted where fear ended. She studied how men gave up when victory still might have been possible. She studied what happened when silence filled the mouths of those who once boasted. She watched, and in watching she found clarity. The counting of shadows became her great preparation, not measuring cattle, not measuring coins, but measuring the psychology of her enemy and the psychology of those around her. She calculated how much weight a shadow could truly carry before it dissolved upon the smallest light, and then she asked herself, what light must I shine to end this shadow? Fear was a sickness across her neighbors. It turned strong men into shaking voices behind closed doors. It made proud families fold themselves into quiet submission. Clara would not participate in that sickness. Instead, she would provide the cure. Her strategy, she realized, did not only serve her own herd. Her defiance would serve as a signal to all others who lived under that same shadow. Her triumph would be proof that the black vultures were only men, no greater, no larger, no more inevitable than those they exploited. A person cannot come to such conclusions without stillness of mind. Clara had cultivated that stillness across years of survival. And now, as she counted in her mind the movements of her enemy, the habits of her neighbors, and the tendency of fear itself, she designed what no one else would design, a plan. Others assumed plans must involve muscle, or involve gathering allies, or involve building forces to match the raiders in kind. But Clara knew better. She had no such numbers waiting, no extra soldiers lingered. Her herd and her intelligence, that was her army, and it had to be enough. She shaped her plan around truths already present. Arrogance blinds men. Predictability defines them. Panic spreads faster through cruel hearts than through innocent ones. By pressing upon each of these truths at the right moment, she could set a trap too perfect, too inexorable, for the black vultures to escape. The woman who'd been called a widow, who had been judged as quiet, who had been measured by others as vulnerable, was now resolved not only to survive, but to strike back. Her silence contained no fear. Her silence contained calculation. The counting of shadows had given her the measure she required, and as she readied herself, she came to realize something that all survivors eventually know. Every great storm is answered not with panic, but with precision. and she would be precise. Her neighbors continued in whispered anxiety, fixing their eyes on a threat they believed was too vast to overcome. Clara turned her eyes instead to possibilities hidden within that same threat, and while they trembled, she sharpened. While they surrendered, she prepared. The stage was nearly set. The outlaws did not know it yet, but the prey lived no longer in Clara Carter. They had chosen someone who would not weigh her life by what was taken, but by how it could be turned against those who had taken it. The shadows were counted, their limits were revealed, and she now stood ready to shine the light that would scatter them. Preparation reveals the difference between those who hope and those who accede. To hope is to wish the storm might pass. To act is to build something to stand inside the storm. Clara Carter was not a creature of hope alone. She was a builder of responses. Every hardship in her life had taught her this lesson. Survival depends not on waiting, but on preparing. Her mind now settled itself fully upon a single conviction. The black vultures could indeed be broken, but not through raw encounter. Not through standing toe-to-toe, not through loud defiance shouted across distances. Their downfall must come through design. Their arrogance must be turned into the very opening they did not realize they offered. And so she began her quiet work. What some would see as simple tasks, Clara shaped into strategy. Every coil of rope, every length of wire, every tool at hand was reconsidered not as everyday material, but as part of a larger instrument. She knew the band would return. Their pattern demanded repetition. They would not be satisfied with their first theft. They would come again, heavier, greedier, hungrier. She could not change that. What she could change was how they left. The first principle of her preparation was to shape the landscape of vulnerability into a weapon. Take what seemed weak and make it strong. Where a corral appeared careless, let it instead be the bait of her choosing. Where wire appeared as fencing, let it instead become the snare that trips their power. Where tools appeared ordinary, shape them into weapons of spirit. And above all, use time as her ally, for she alone valued time while they wasted it in arrogance. She set her mind upon fire, not fire as devastation, but fire as illusion, for fire is a tool of psychology as much as destruction. A sudden blaze confuses men, terrifies animals, twists order into panic. Fire would serve not as her sword, but as a curtain, masking her moves, blinding theirs. She set her mind upon wire, not wire as idle material, but wire as the hidden hand. For stretched across paths unseen, wire becomes a trap. Horses stumble where men believe footing is secure. Riders fall hardest not from gunfire, but from surprise. Wire would serve as the quiet strength, holding until their frantic momentum broke against it. She set her mind upon arrangement. Positioning was everything, to show them what they expected to see in order to draw them to where they did not expect to fall. One pen left vulnerable here, one opening left deliberate there, each detail constructed not as accident, but as invitation, and arrogance would RSVP to that invitation without hesitation. All the while, in her spirit, Clara remained calm. Anger would serve no purpose. Panic would unmake careful work. What she needed most was patience. Each knot tied, each piece placed, each imagined step rehearsed in her mind. That was where her true strength emerged. She had no army of men, but she had an army of plans, and plans, executed at the right moment, could become unstoppable. Clara Carter knew from years of life's lessons that those who feel hunger in the belly will sometimes make foolish mistakes, but those who feel hunger in the ego will make foolish mistakes every time. The black vultures were not hungry men seeking to feed themselves. They were arrogant men hungering for power. Their pride demanded they prove themselves again and again by humiliating others. This pride would be her perfect weapon. Offer them humiliation to seize, and they would grab eagerly. Offer them humiliation to witness, and they would press forward greedily. In that greed, they would stumble straight into her web. Wire, fire, cattle, traps, plans set carefully. Each piece small on its own, but together, woven by her quiet genius, they formed something larger, a death blow to arrogance. It is important to understand what Clara accomplished here. She did not prepare by outmatching her enemy's force. She prepared by outthinking them. Many have believed victory belongs to the faster shot, to the stronger arm, to the larger number. Clara instead showed that victory belongs to the sharper mind. She turned the tools everyone else overlooked, the ordinary materials, the unnoticed details, the patterns of human folly, into instruments of war. Every survivor of hardship knows this secret. You cannot always win by sheer strength, but you can win by never wasting what is in front of you. Clara used everything. Every scrap, every tool, every calculation. The black vultures would find themselves trapped not by brute resistance, but by the ingenuity of a woman they believed incapable. And as she finalized her preparations, Clara reached a stillness inside herself. She had accepted the reality of risk. She did not imagine herself invincible. She did not imagine the plan flawless, but she believed in principles. She believed arrogance always leaves its throat exposed. She believed cruelty carries its own breaking point. And she believed that survival belongs to those willing to think when others surrender to fear. Wire would trip their speed, fire would blind their sight, confusion would splinter their unity, panic would break their pride. And in that collapse, they would be defeated. The work was done with steady patience. What outsiders could not see was that each simple action was loaded with meaning. By nightfall, Clara had reshaped not only her defenses but her very identity. She was no longer simply surviving, she was now hunting the hunters. This chapter of her life became the true pivot. It was the moment when she transformed from one who endures into one who strikes back. Quietly, patiently, no boasting, no wild claims, but with certainty. And soon, when the black vultures returned, they would encounter something they had never faced before. They would walk into a battlefield designed not for their triumph, but for their ruin. Every plan reaches its moment of trial. Days and nights of thought eventually compress into a single point in time where all must come together. And that moment arrived for Clara Carter when the black vultures reappeared. They believed they were returning to take what was now theirs. They believed their earlier raid had secured her fear, softened her resolve, erased her will to resist. That was how their pattern always worked. They fed themselves on repetition. Strike once, retreat, then return greater. Strike again, crush completely, and remind the world no one could rise against them. They had used this very rhythm countless times. It had become so familiar to them that they no longer questioned whether their enemy might prepare against it. Clara knew it. She had counted on it. And as soon as their arrogance carried them to her gates a second time, the hidden design of her silent work began to whisper its answer. The strength of her plan lay not in thunderous action, but in the quiet orchestration of their downfall. She had studied them, she had arranged for them. And when they arrived to take once more, what they actually entered was the theatre of their own unmaking. It began subtly. Their entry was easy, just as they expected. The placement of what seemed vulnerable appeared again. Cattle clearly held too loosely, access seeming too open, security appearing thin. Each detail was deliberate, each one chosen to feed their arrogance. Arrogant men need to believe their target is helpless. The first glance confirmed for them what Clara wanted them to believe, that they would once again succeed easily. And so, without hesitation, they fell deeper into the snare. Then it began. Momentum met calculation. They, riding forward in careless confidence. She, holding her breath and waiting for the moment when their speed would become their downfall. The wires she had stretched across hidden paths began to reveal themselves, not as obstacles seen, but as disasters felt. Hooves struck suddenly against force invisible. Horses reared, riders toppled. Order collapsed into chaos in less than seconds. Confusion spread like a fever through their ranks. Nothing unravels men of arrogance faster than surprise. Guns did not cause them to stumble. Shouting did not undo them. They were undone by their own assumptions, colliding violently against the reality Clara had prepared. And as confusion set in, fire revealed itself. Flames leapt in places designed not for devastation, but for spectacle. A single spark could blind the eyes when matched with panic. The flames cast shadows whirling across the ground, turning clear directions into nightmares of light and dark. Their order was gone. Their certainty was traded for doubt. Their laughter, once cruel, turned into anger mingled with sudden unease. And there was the true brilliance of Clara's trap. She had not merely designed obstacles for their bodies, she had designed obstacles for their minds. Men ride with composure when they feel dominance. Men break into fragments when they feel confusion. Desperation spread quickly among them. Each one believed the other would restore leadership, but each one followed panic instead. They shouted, stumbled, turned on themselves. Pride dissolved, for pride is only strong when untested. Once fractured, it becomes weaker than even fear. Meanwhile, Clara remained still and steady. The moment belonged not to haste, but to timing. She had created the conditions. Now she merely watched those conditions tear through their arrogance. Other ranchers might have wasted energy in scrambling resistance. Clara did the harder thing. She trusted her design. Years of surviving hardship had taught her to endure in stillness while the storm played out. And indeed the storm belonged to them, not to her. For the first time in their violent careers, the Black Vultures knew chaos not as a weapon they wielded, but as a weight on their own shoulders. Understand the meaning here. Clara did not break them with overwhelming force. She broke their illusion. That illusion that they could never stumble, never falter, never fail, shattered the moment hidden wires sent men crashing to the ground, the moment flames licked across their path, the moment panic infected their confidence. The trap was not primarily physical, it was psychological. The wires did not simply trip horses. The fire did not simply block movement. Together, they screamed one message into the outlaws' souls. You are not in control. And that message was poison to men who lived only on dominance. Panic does what no bullet can fully achieve. It fractures unity. The gang, once feared for its cohesion, now split apart. Each rider thought to save himself. The herd they sought to steal no longer served as prize. It served instead as chaos, surging against them with weight they had not accounted for. Every living creature caught in the strangeness of that night became a weapon against those who believed themselves masters of all things. Their arrogance had walked them willingly into her design, and what they found there was their own end beginning. It must be remembered that Clara Carter did not fight them on their terms. She did not ride fast and hope to outgun them. She did not gather numbers and try to meet them equally. She constructed her ground with thought. She laid every piece with intention. And then, in stillness, she stood as the orchestra played itself out, each instrument of panic sounding against them in perfect sequence. This is what separates strategy from brute force. Brute force exhausts itself quickly, always demanding more. Strategy multiplies itself. Clara's strategy meant that with every stumble, with every confused shout, with every flame and crash, her strength was multiplied, while their certainty was divided. And the Black Vultures felt it in their blood. Some fell, some scrambled. Others pulled away in shock, unable to interpret what had even struck them. They had walked into something they could not explain, and in not being able to explain it, their courage dissolved. It was in this moment that Clara's legend truly began to rise. Not from noise, not from gunfire, not from boasting, but from silence, from patience, from calculation. Her plan was the storm, and she merely held steady within it. And no storm of arrogance could hold against the storm of her preparation. Every design has a climax, a point where the careful arrangement reaches its sharpest purpose. For Clara Carter, this point came when the power of her herd became thunder, not the thunder of docile creatures grazing without cause, but the thunder of instinct, turned loose, turned fierce, turned into the very weight of justice. Justice does not always arrive in the hands of men holding scales and titles. On the frontier, justice has no courthouses. It has no speeches. It reveals itself in the raw reversal of power. And that night, justice came not from law, but from Clara's ingenuity and the stampede she unleashed. The black vultures, already stumbling through the traps of wire and blinded by the burst of flame, now faced something they had never tasted from a victim. Overwhelming force, not through bullets, but through the very cattle they intended to steal. The herd, restless and pressed by the chaos Clara had engineered, burst free in motion. They became a flood of weight and breath. They surged forward, not with the organization of an army, but with the primal certainty of instinct set loose. Nothing human could stop it. And once it began, the men who believed themselves unstoppable found themselves suddenly smaller than dust in the face of it. The ground itself shuddered under that living torrent. The sound of hooves magnified fear in the hearts of men who already fought panic. Each outlaw, already shaken by wires, already startled by fire, already fractured by confusion, now felt the earth rise against them. Their sense of dominance cracked entirely. Stampedes symbolize the one truth arrogant men never accept. Control is fragile. You may posture as strong, you may carry weapons, you may revel in fear, but when reality decides otherwise, you are swept aside. Clara Carter exploited that truth. She understood that to turn chaos into an ally was stronger than trying to match violence with violence. So the herd became her allies. Their hooves pressed against the arrogance of the black vultures. Their bodies tore past barriers. Their wild momentum turned the gang's intended prize into their undoing. And here lies the brilliance of Clara's strategy. The same creatures the black vultures had sought as symbols of power now rejected them. Their prideful attempt to take what was hers became the very avalanche that buried their reputation. To them, cattle represented wealth and triumph. To her, in this moment, cattle represented retribution. Each outlaw, once tightly bound to his leader in unity, now scattered in self-preservation. Men who boast most loudly of their control fall apart most easily when control is ripped away. Some tried to flee the stampede, scrambling with broken order. Others froze, unprepared for the wall of sound and motion. Their weapons meant nothing against the living tide. And beyond the physical crushing weight was the psychological truth. For the first time they saw what Clara had known all along. They were mortal. Their legendary name, their arrogance, their swagger, all of it collapsed in the face of something they could not dictate. Pride feeds upon submission, but panic hunts pride until it breaks. And the panic now belonged to them. This was justice, not slow, not kindly, but raw, decisive, undeniable. Justice wrapped inside hooves pounding in endless rhythm. Justice louder than their threats. Justice carried out without words, delivered in Clara's silence and in their fear. It must be remembered that Clara herself did not ride with the herd. She stood apart, steady, knowing the power she had unleashed. That was her genius. She did not need to step wildly into the chaos. She only needed to have created it. And once it was created, the herd carried out her sentence faster and surer than any hand with a weapon, and still her work glowed with meaning deeper than the mere ruin of outlaws. For the lesson here was not vengeance, it was inversion. Those who had laughed as they frightened others now quaked at the sound of hooves. Those who had built their empire upon fear now drowned in their own. Their dominance vanished beneath dust and disarray. Every bandit depends upon reputation. Every outlaw rides upon the legend of their supposed invincibility. Break that illusion and you break the man himself. And this stampede became the hammer cracking their illusion finally, irrevocably. When all was concluded, when panic drove them into fragments, when scattered bodies showed the collapse of an entire unit, one truth stood unshaken. Clara Carter's stampede had rewritten the terms of power. No longer was she merely the widow others pitied. No longer was she merely the quiet one neighbors underestimated. She had become the example of what it means to think beyond suffering. She had transformed instinct itself into weapon. She had turned the arrogance of predators into the panic of prey. This is why tradition remembers her story. Not because she used greater force, but because she used greater intelligence. Not because she shouted louder, but because she remained silent, letting the trap speak in her place. This is why people leaned forward in admiration when her name was spoken. She had revealed the age-old truth the West tried often to forget. Courage and cunning can stampede arrogance until its bones are dust. The justice that fell on the black vultures that night was not abstract, not gentle, not official, it was simple. Clara Carter had counted their shadows, tied her wires, lit her fires, and targeted their pride. And when the moment came, she loosened the flood of hooves upon them. That was justice, a justice that no arrogance could withstand, a justice stamped into the very ground they once claimed to own. And the sound of that justice echoed longer than any story they had once told of themselves, because it carried her name now, not theirs. Every tale of defiance has one defining instant, an instant where the meaning of the entire struggle condenses into a single gesture. For Clara Carter, that instant was not the traps, it was not the wires, it was not even the stampede, those were the prelude. The true climax came with one shot. One moment, one decision, one act of calm precision that shattered arrogance outright. The black vultures had already been broken in spirit when the stampede struck. Panic gnawed through their chests. Confusion tore through their minds. They were no longer a unified gang, no longer the predators they once pretended to be. They were scattered individuals fighting for footing. But even in collapse, pride clings hardest to its leader. Arrogant men fall, and yet grasp desperately to stand taller than others. And here, among the wreckage of his gang's composure, stood the one they looked to, their leader. Leaders of such gangs do not inspire through vision. They inspire through threat, through ritual cruelty, through gripping men tighter under the weight of shared violence. He, more than any other, embodied the illusion of invincibility. His pride was heavier than theirs, his reputation was stronger than theirs, and when all else faltered, he still believed his own legend. But here is the brutal irony. Pride survives only until reality snatches it away. Clara watched calmly as he sought to reclaim control, as he attempted to summon the power of voice and posture, as if his mere stance could halt the unmaking crafted against him. He was nothing but a man in panic, draped in the shreds of his arrogance. In that instant, Clara Carter knew the entire shape of his undoing could be encapsulated in one symbol, one precise act that displayed what the truth had always been. She did not act in haste. Haste belonged to the desperate. Her moment was measured. She had no need for wildfire, no need for rapidity. She allowed the silence to stretch longer than most could bear, because silence itself is power when set against noise. And when the silence was ready, when the meaning pressed most heavily upon the world, she chose her moment. The single shot rang out. No storm of gunfire followed, no exchange of chaos marked it. One shot, deliberate, calm, final. The effect was not merely physical, it was symbolic. That shot stripped away the last thread of arrogance their leader carried. It struck harder than any bullet to the body, for it destroyed the illusion that shielded him. Around him, the gang no longer saw a figure unbreakable. They saw a man defeated. They saw what Clara had always seen, that men who puff themselves up to appear invincible are merely men, and men crumble. The silence after that single shot echoed louder than the noise itself. It was the silence that spoke, the silence that told every surviving outlaw that the game was finished, that their terror had no meaning now. Silence, heavier than thunder, holding them immobile in their recognition of loss, and thus it was completed. The stampede had caused panic, but the single shot finalized their ruin. No chance of rebuilding remained, no hope of reorganizing, no scrap of intimidation to gather. Everything had collapsed into the cold clarity of truth. Their time was over. Understand, this was not vengeance in fury. This was not the shout of rage. This was the calm act of a person who had calculated carefully, who had moved patiently, who had shaped an entire battle, not as screaming rage, but as purpose. Clara Carter did not live by wrath. She lived by resolve, and that resolve made her shot truer than the boasting gunman who believed speed or noise proved strength. The legend endures because of that act. People retold it, how all the chaos, all the tumult, ended in quiet focus. Neighbors repeated to one another that it wasn't a firefight that finished the Black Vultures, but a solitary act of precision. They emphasized the restraint, the stillness, the patience of that one shot. No story endures longer than one carrying such paradox. Calm greater than chaos, silence greater than noise, one woman greater than an entire gang. This is why history remembers her by that moment. The trap displayed her intelligence. The stampede displayed her ingenuity. But the single shot displayed her character, the embodiment of patience, clarity, and exact resolve. Victory came not from volume, but from precision. It came not from frenzy, but from composure. It came not from overwhelming force, but from knowing with certainty when to act and how to act, and letting everything else fall. That is why Clara Carter's tale stretched far beyond her herd and her valley. It became a universal story. It reminded people that skill does not always mean excess, that victory does not always roar. Sometimes true victory whispers in a single decisive sound, then leaves silence greater than any storm. One shot, that was all. And by that shot, Clara Carter struck not only through a man, she struck through a legend that had once terrorized all who lived under its shadow. And in doing so, she replaced it with a new legend, her own. Every storm has an end. Every night, however terrible, must break into morning. And morning is the cruelest test of all, for in its light, exaggerations dissolve and illusions collapse. Morning reveals not what people feared, but what truly happened. For Clara Carter, morning became the moment where her victory transformed from personal survival into public truth. The Black Vultures had been scattered, their confidence shattered, their unity undone. Their leader, once the symbol of their invincibility, had fallen to the deliberate stillness of her hand. And when dawn arrived, others who doubted her began to whisper that something impossible had just been proven. The morning revealed prisoners where once there had been predators. The morning revealed the broken silence of arrogance, replaced by the silence of defeat. And most importantly, the morning revealed Clara herself, not as a victim to be pitied, not as a widow meant to yield, but as something greater, an emblem of refusal, an emblem of resilience, an emblem of strategy turned into triumph. It is here the story shifted. Her legend was not written the night of fight alone. It was written when survivors looked upon her in the clarity of day and saw what remained. What remained was not despair. What remained was not fear. What remained was order reclaimed, independence preserved, and dignity stronger than ever before. Morning became the reckoning not only of the gang, who sat bound in the shame of their collapse, but of every neighbor who had whispered that resistance was meaningless. For now they had no words left, they had no argument remaining. Their certainty had declared no one could stand against the Black Vultures. Clara Carter's reality declared it had already been done. That is the power of example. Many talk of what cannot be overcome, until one person simply overcomes it. Then suddenly the impossibility becomes history. Impossible yesterday becomes inevitable tomorrow. That transformation spread across her community as morning stretched into noon. Every mind recalibrated itself, forced to admit what it had denied. The fear they had nurtured was heavier than the men themselves, for the men were mortal and they had been broken. But do not mistake Clara's composure for celebration. She did not parade her victory. She did not waste the morning in vanity. That was not her way. To her, triumph was not about exaltation. Triumph was continuity. It was keeping her herd. It was protecting her labor. It was ensuring that her independence endured. That, to Clara Carter, was victory enough. And yet, for those who had doubted her, this calm dignity only multiplied her legend. They saw a woman who had faced down what no man dared resist, and instead of boasting, she simply continued her work, her carriage steady, her presence unshaken. This restraint impressed them even more than any fury could have, for fury burns quickly. But composure endures. The reckoning here was not only about the capture of criminals, it was about the collapse of myth. The myth that told people to bow, the myth that told people no one could resist, the myth that told communities their only future was subservience to cruelty. Clara Carter had annihilated that myth by standing unbroken in the dawn. The morning cemented the truth. Courage disguised as silence is stronger than cruelty disguised as power. For some, silence meant weakness. For Clara, silence was preparation. And when proven, it stood taller than any loud reputation built on fear. The sheriff, who represented law and order that too often trailed behind reality, could only acknowledge what Clara had already established. Justice had been delivered before he arrived. Justice had been given not by the structures of authority, but by the determination of one who refused to bow. Morning always asks this of us. What remains after hardship, after storms, after chaos? For Clara, what remained was her herd, her independence, her resilience, and her name, now burned into the respect of others. What remained for the black vultures was humiliation and certainty of their end. What remained for the neighbors was revelation that fear had deceived them more powerfully than crime itself. This is reckoning, not just punishment of criminals, but punishment of doubt. Doubt that says survival is impossible, doubt that says some powers cannot be challenged, doubt that paralyzes communities into surrender. Clara had destroyed that doubt, and the story of her defiance became stronger than the story of their cruelty. The morning therefore wrote a new truth across the land. That truth was simple. Ordinary strength, when sharpened by courage and intelligence, is greater than legendary cruelty. That truth walked in Clara's composure, and that truth walked in the shame of men once feared like shadows. The reckoning was finished. The storm had passed. The sun of clarity revealed everything, stripped of rumor, stripped of fear, stripped of doubt. Clara Carter remained unmoved, her victory not in bluster, but in the fact that her spirit endured where others said it would not. And that endurance was now her legacy. Every story worth telling carries something larger than the event itself. The facts of the Black Vulture's defeat are simple enough. A raid attempted, a trap sprung, panic delivered, a leader humbled. But facts alone do not explain why people remembered. They remembered because of what the event said about ordinary life, about human strength, about the difference between fear and resolve. And so, the story of Clara Carter is not merely about one woman. It is about what happens when endurance meets arrogance. It is about how intelligence defeats intimidation. It is about how courage does not require volume or weaponry, but rather patience, clarity, and an unwillingness to surrender. Clara's lesson begins with fear. Fear is the oldest weapon known to humankind. It requires no bullet, no blade, no strength of arm. Fear rules by planting itself before the fight even begins. It spreads across neighbors, robs people of possibility, convinces voices to grow quiet. And fear convinced an entire community that the black vultures could never be stopped. Yet Clara exposed that lie. She proved fear is never more than a shadow. It appears large, but has no body of its own. Shine light upon it, and it collapses. Her lesson continues with arrogance. Arrogance prides itself on confidence and strength, but true arrogance is always frailty disguised. Arrogance blinds the very men who rely on it. It makes them predictable. It makes them careless. It convinces them they alone are authors of destiny, when in truth their end is already written by their own repetition. Clara understood this deeply. She saw their predictability and used their pride against them, and arrogance once struck shatters completely. Her lesson continues with endurance. Many mistake endurance for silent suffering. They call it weakness, they call it passivity. But endurance, rightly understood, is the most powerful of qualities. To endure is to hold until the right moment can be shaped. To endure is to resist surrender. To endure is to survive storms until storms can be turned into strength. Clara did not endure simply to suffer quietly. She endured with purpose, and in enduring with purpose, she found her chance to prevail. Her lesson concludes with simplicity. Too often people assume victory is only possible through complex weapons, greater armies, overwhelming displays of strength. But simplicity can be sharper than complication, a length of wire, a burst of fire, the momentum of a herd, one deliberate shot. Each piece simple, each piece ordinary, yet in Clara's hands combined into something extraordinary. She proved it is not the size of tools that matters, but the sharpness of the mind that arranges them. And so, long after the dust settled around the downfall of the black vultures, her name lived on because her story was useful. It gave comfort to those who feared. It gave warning to those who grew arrogant. It gave insight to those who endured. And above all, it gave inspiration. A reminder that even when odds are weighty, storms can be weathered and turned. Her neighbors carried that story. They repeated it around gatherings, stretching their voices as if they themselves had stood witness to her endurance. Travelers spread it, saying that in one corner of the range, a woman had outmatched a terrorizing gang. And others retold it as allegory, using Clara Carter as the embodiment of wit and justice overcoming brute cruelty. That is how legends spread, not through loud announcements, but through the slow repetition of those in need of a lesson. Clara's personal battle was retold until it belonged not only to her, but to all who faced fear, all who endured hardship, all who wondered if their quiet strength mattered in a world that celebrated volume. The more it spread, the more the meaning deepened. Farmers used it to remind themselves that patience would see them through. Merchants told it to explain that no tyranny lasts forever. Children heard it and learned that courage wears many faces. Not only the heroic shout, but also the steady silence that refuses to break. Even generations later, her truth lingered. For conditions change, but principles remain. Fear still seeks to rule, arrogance still blinds, endurance is still required, and intelligence, patiently applied, still cuts sharper than any blade. These apply not only on ranches, but in every life, in every struggle, whether in the open or hidden inside hearts. Clara Carter became more than a name. She became a symbol. To say her name was to recall that one can face overwhelming odds and still bend those odds back upon themselves. To say her name was to recall that cunning is strength. To say her name was to recall that quiet preparation can topple loud cruelty. And so the lesson endures, passed across time like dust carried by endless wind. The lesson that fear is hollow, the lesson that arrogance writes its own downfall, the lesson that endurance forges strength, the lesson that simplicity, sharpened by intelligence, can crush what appears unstoppable. This is the legacy Clara Carter left not only to her neighbors, but to all who have ever listened, that the storms meant to destroy can instead write your destiny if you stand with clarity. That endurance is not weakness, it is the foundation by which legends are built. That cleverness need not apologize for being clever. It is the very thing that ensures survival. Clara Carter's tale closed one chapter of violence, but in telling and retelling, her tale opened something far greater: hope for those who doubt, warning for those who swagger, and reminder for those who endure. Her legend bore the weight of all three, and so, from then until now, her memory rides quietly across history. Her triumph is retold not as spectacle, but as testimony. A testimony that one person, standing firm in patience and wit, can overturn forces the world calls immense. That is the truth drawn from the range. That is the truth carved from dust. That is the truth carried like gunpowder, held quietly until the moment arrives to spark. And with that spark, as Clara Carter proved, darkness can be broken forever. And so the trail ends. Clara Carter's name, once whispered in doubt, now rides forever in stories of grit and cunning. If this tale stirred something in you, tip your hat by hitting that like button, and ride with us again by tapping subscribe. And before the embers fade, leave your mark below. Tell us where you're watching from. Each voice adds to this circle. Each place adds to this trail we share. Until next time, keep your courage steady, keep your wits sharp, and may your own story ride just as true.